Gwatsi, Keshe, greetings. I'm Jon Ghahate. I'm the museum cultural educator here at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm from the pueblos of Laguna and Zuni. I'm from the Badger and Turkey clans. I'm here to introduce you and explain to you something that we oftentimes don't get the information about as it applies to U.S. history. That topic that we're going to talk about today is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. So we're going to talk about some things that occurred, some of the factors that contributed to the actions taken by the Pueblo people, some of the ramifications that exist in the 21st century that are very elemental and contribute to why these civilizations and these societies still exist today. So what we're going to be talking about is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Prior to 1492, in the Western Hemisphere, there were many civilizations, there are many governments, there are many societies that existed on this side of the world that oftentimes we get exposed to the knowledge that these were just barbarian, non-civilized individuals, civilizations that existed here. But we know that from what history tells us, both from the historical construct, but also from our oral narratives from many of the indigenous communities here in the Western Hemisphere, many of these civilizations had established social structures, had established spiritual belief systems. Majority of them were matrilineal societies, as well as they had specific social boundaries that allowed them to exist as civilizations, with societies that were stable and that were enduring for at least 5 centuries prior to the Europeans coming to this side of the world. And so that's what we're going to talk about. But one of the things that we're going to talk about and focus on is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. At least a century before the Declaration of Independence and the forming of the United States of America, the Pueblo people of the Southwest, of what we now call the Southwest part of the United States, took it upon themselves to declare their right to be free, declare their right to have their own belief systems, declare their right to exist as human beings, and most importantly, to claim that right. And so that's what the Pueblo Revolt is about. The Declaration of Independence and the formation of the United States of America, its foundation was just to say to the crown or to a monarchy that we don't want to be taxed anymore, that we want to make our own laws, that we want to exist as free societies. The Pueblo people of the Southwest did that same thing, but most importantly, above all that, they claimed their right to exist as human beings. Above all, their right to be here, the right to breathe, the right to live, the right to have their own families. That's what the Pueblo Revolt is essential, not just necessarily freedom, or not just necessarily governmental laws, but really the right to exist. That's what the Pueblo Revolt focuses on. The Pueblo Revolt focuses on a number of factors that you see on your screen. Most importantly, who determines who is human being? Who determines how one is supposed to and can believe? Who determines where one can live? Who determines how one can exercise their right to self-govern themselves? These are some of the factors that contributed to the Pueblo people deciding through a series of policies imposed on them by the Spanish crown to say, we are no longer going to live like this. We are no longer going to allow our people to suffer and die and no longer live the life that was created for us by our ancestors. That's what the Pueblo Revolt is all about. And so that's what this whole learning opportunity is all about. Learning about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. A couple of things we need to learn about the Pueblo people is, first of all, the term Pueblo was imposed upon these indigenous communities throughout the southern United States, where there were many civilizations and societies that lived in this area at least 5 centuries before Europeans came to this side of the world. We know that from archaeological digs, from historical documents, as well as what science tells us to confirm that these civilizations existed. How they existed was because they used science, they used certain technologies, they used certain philosophies and different social structures to allow them to live as stable societies some of them for at least 400 years before the Spanish even came. Science tells us that throughout the southwest of the United States, many civilizations existed. They interacted with one another. There was trade. There was many things that occurred. Some of the things we see in the 21st century, such as foodstuffs like corn, beans, squash, certain vegetables, certain social structures, still remain elemental today to many of these civilizations and societies. Prior to that, with those civilizations that existed here, that now are part of the United States National Monument System, is that we can see how those societies created their communities. They use technologies, they use physics, biology, and use many science constructs to allow these civilizations to exist. Throughout the southwestern part of the United States, there are many civilizations that exist here, all distinctly different from their social structures, distinctly from their spiritual constructs, distinct from their societal foundation that allowed them to be these civilizations. And many of those civilizations remain pretty much the same way as it was almost 1,000 years ago. Many of those communities still exist. And many of those communities still exist on the very foundations in which they built. We have many communities that were here that developed many of these social structures. That's the one thing we also want to help as part of our mission at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. Although we talk about Native Americans, not all Native Americans had the same social structures that were here in what we now call the United States. As it applies to the Pueblo people, again, received that name from the Spanish. Some of the names that we talk about when it applies to the Pueblo people are the Ashui. Those are what we now call the Zuni, the Gwaikome. Those are the people that come from another group of people, the Akume. They are also names that we use as part of our languages to help identify who we were compared to another group of people. The word Pueblo actually comes from Latin, and by the Spanish coming here, they saw certain social structures, and they began to identify these groups of people as Pueblo compared to those that were not sedentary, predominantly permanent agrarian societies, such as our neighbors, the Navajo, the Apache, and several other groups that lived throughout the Southwest that had not developed that same social structure. And so we refer to them today as non-Pueblo, and those of us who have these social structures as Pueblo. Some of those social structures that exist even today that are practiced, as I mentioned, apply to the spiritual belief systems that existed. They apply to their governmental structures. The Spanish use the word cacique, which actually comes from a Arawak word from the Caribbean, which identified a particular person or a particular individual that perhaps was given a leadership role, but that was decided as a collective, deciding that they're going to choose this individual to make the decisions that would benefit everybody. And so that was the collective idea of leadership, of governmental self-determination, and those constructs that existed today. In addition to that, there were other components as a society that allowed them to be seen as spiritual based. And perhaps this is what contributed to the Spanish then seeing to these individuals, to these communities, as them recognizing a spiritual construct and saying that therefore they could perhaps be converted into Christianity. Because we know that in the European theater prior to 1400s, that other civilizations and communities that were not seen as human or spiritual based or have a spiritual conscience, they were really not worthy of the Christian faith, and therefore many of them were persecuted. Genocide was incorporated only because the Spanish crown and or those Catholic-based monarchies did not see them worthy of being converted to the Christian faith. For the Pueblo people, because of that spiritual construct, the Spanish then worked diligently and oftentimes very forcefully to convert them to Christianity because they felt that they were worthy of the Christian faith. Other civilizations did not fare as well because we know from reports from a man who was a Franciscan priest Fray Bartholomew de las Casas, who wrote a report. It's called a brief report of the destruction of the Indies in 1542, where he wrote that some of the Spanish individuals who represented the Spanish crown saw some of these indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, and certainly in the and certainly in Mexico as not worthy of the Christian faith, and therefore they were pretty much persecuted and they were basically outright killed. So perhaps that was one benefit, and even today the Catholic faith is very prominent in our Pueblo communities. The Spanish crown began to invade and encroach upon the indigenous communities throughout what we now know as Mexico, as well as the southwestern part of the United States, as early as 1529. This was after at least several years after the Spanish had defeated the Aztec Empire, and as they realized there was more land to the north of what we now call Mexico City. Through that period of time, there was gradual encroachment. One of the most northern provinces at that time was a community called Zacatecas. Zacatecas became a very strong and very important silver mining enterprise by many Spaniards who came here to make money and make a name for themselves. But because of disease, overwork, and enslavement, many of those indigenous community members that lived in that immediate area gradually either died or were killed off. And so what occurred over the next 20 years was that the Spanish gradually would search out other communities for other workers to be brought in as slaves. This past year, in 2019, the United States commemorated 1619 as the time when African slaves were brought into what we now call the United States. But we know that at least a century and a half before that, because of the significant death rate of indigenous peoples in the Americas and the need for more workers, that's why the Spanish and the Portuguese brought more slaves and therefore the Africans into what we now call the United States. It was only because of the demise and genocide of indigenous peoples that now we have African members of our communities in our communities now, because there were no longer workers here to do the needs and complete the work for the Spanish colonizers. One of the most important efforts gradually, as the Spanish were progressing northward into what we call the southwest part of the United States, was a man by the name of Fray Marcos de Niza. He was a priest that was appointed to lead an expedition in 1539 to look for what would be potential large communities, perhaps very prominent riches. Certainly they were looking for gold, but the paramount reason why the Spanish were still looking for any land opportunities was many of them were still very much enthralled with the idea that they were just this close to getting to China, or what was China, what we now call China, or the Far East at that time, because the main driver for exploration into the Western Hemisphere was its need or desire for the spices and the riches, and certainly the gold that came from the Far East. They were still very much convinced that the earth was much smaller than what it was, and therefore they wanted to get to Asia because they were in need of those things. And so they continued to have this idea that if we just go over the next mesa, over the next hill, over the next valley, we're going to run into Asia any day now. And so that was still the belief up until at least the early 1800s, when they finally realized, after the discovery of the Pacific Ocean by Magellan and finally circumnavigating around the globe, that they realized that they were nowhere close to Eastern Asia. Historically, we know from the Spanish accounts, as well as from the oral narratives of our Pueblo people, that there were many, many communities here in what we now call New Mexico, predominantly along what we now call the Rio Grande River. The Rio Grande River has a large and long historical geological history as it applies to its formation, as well as it contributing to why these Pueblo communities around the 12th century began to develop their communities within 5 miles of the river itself. Over those next 3 centuries, those communities developed into large, multiple-story structured communities, large, multiple expanded family community members, as well as becoming a predominantly agrarian society. Because as communities began to grow, they need more food, they need more resources, and by having the river close by, they have those opportunities to develop those communities. There are some outlying communities that are further away, some as way as 300 miles to the west of the Rio Grande, but they were still very predominantly agrarian societies, but not necessarily living close enough to a large permanent river as a water source. We know these things because many of those communities still exist. At the time the Spanish came, as the Spanish were progressing north along the Rio Grande, these communities were encountered and confronted by the Spanish, demanding provisions, demanding things from them, and oftentimes brutally interfering with the community members. Some reports of rape, others atrocities, because initially they did not see them as very developed, not like the Aztecs because of the societal structures, but they were still very much communities as a whole. And these communities, though some of them are no longer here, we do see remnants of them in the national parks and the remains of those communities here. Those communities still remain and very much in the 21st century, still very much live, active communities. Beginning in 1539 is the beginning of that fateful day when the Spanish first came and presented themselves, and the Pueblo people realized that there was a bigger world that was out there. They had never seen a horse. They had never seen a man with a beard. They had never seen a person of light skin. They had never seen someone with a weapon such as a rifle and or a crossbow. These were entirely new experiences for them. They had seen one black person, and that black person's name we now know as Estebanico. That man originally comes from Morocco, and through a series of events beginning in 1526, he eventually ended up in Mexico after an 8-year period of wandering in the southern part of the United States, Texas, Louisiana, and eventually finding his way back into Mexico City with a number of other individuals from a group of 400 men who initially sailed to Florida in 1528, becoming shipwrecked, and through those 8 years finally making it back to Mexico City. Through that period of time of that 8 years wandering around in the desert, he was told of this potentially mythical place where there were many resources and gold, and perhaps some of those indigenous peoples perhaps just wanted to get them out of their hair, and so maybe they started this myth. Throughout those experiences, eventually the Viceroy of New Spain, Mendoza, sent Estebanico and Fray Marcos de Niza to explore this area. So in July of 1539, this expedition came to the Pueblo of Hawiku, which we now call the Pueblo of Zuni. Unfortunately, there was a skirmish. Estebanico was killed, and the priest, Fray Marcos de Niza, returned back to Mexico City and explained that he had seen the cities of gold, that he had seen the roads were even paved with gold, and this spurred an excitement so that within a few months, the next person to come up into this area was a man we now know as Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. He followed the exact directions that were given to him, but when he came to the Pueblo of Zuni, he and his men were very disappointed because it was not that big city of gold and that big palaces that they had seen previously in Mexico City. And because of this, the men were so angry at the priest for telling this lie that Coronado sent dedicated soldiers that he could count on to escort the priest back to Mexico City under the threat of their death, of anything happening to the priest, so he could undergo trial for lying to the Spanish crown. And for the next 2 years, from 1539 to 1542, Coronado spent those 2 years looking for these fabled cities of gold. This became the 2-year expedition of Coronado as we looked throughout the whole facility, going as far west as what we now call the Grand Canyon and as far east as what we now call Kansas. He spent those 2 years looking for what was supposedly these riches, these gold, and perhaps still looking for a way to China. Eventually, in the spring of 1540, he returned back to Mexico City, very discouraged, and only because to come up into this area, they had to pay for everything. All of these men who came up here had to put all the money up front. They invested in it. But because of that, it was discouraging, and it took another 50 years for the Spanish to finally decide to come up to this area because this was still land claimed for the Spanish crown. Over the next 80 years, from 1589 to 1680, was the presence and the occupation of this land by the Spanish crown. The three policies that the Spanish crown incorporated in coming up into this area, the first one was called the Recuerdo. The Recuerdo was a policy established by King Charles I of Spain, which basically said to the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, as the Spanish were encroaching into their communities, they would read this aloud. Oftentimes it would be in Spanish, which most of the people didn't speak anyway. But to summarize it, it basically said, we are here representing the Spanish crown, the Christian church, the body of Christ. We bring good news, but we also come with a heavy hand. And you are expected to submit to us. You are expected to give us what we ask for. And if you choose not to do it, we will enslave you. We will sell your children. We will kill you. But it will not be our fault because you refused our declaration. And this is called the Recuerdo. The second policy was called the Encomida. The Encomida began in the 13th century as the Spanish were overcoming the Moors and the Muslims in Spain, so that when they finally defeated them, they could take whatever they had and they could force the Muslims and the Moors that were in Spain to become subjugate to them, to become slaves, and it was called the Encomida. And lastly, the other policy that the Spanish crown was called the Repartimento. And the Repartimento was a policy that the Spanish crown said that as we come into this land, it is up to us being sovereign, having the right and the blessings of God, that we can take the land and we can decide what we want to do with the land. And so by doing that, these three policies created just horrible events for the Pueblo people. One of the predominant events that occurred began in 1599. We know that a man by the name of Don Juan de Oñate had come now through what we call Nuevo Mexico, now called New Mexico. He was the governor at the time. He was appointed to be the governor. He sent his nephew to the Pueblo of Acoma, which is on a 300-foot butte on top of this mesa butte. They demanded, because they were implementing the policies of the Encomida, the demand that you give me the things I need. I don't have to pay for it. I can take it. Well, they demanded that. The people of Acoma decided, no, we're not going to do this. There was a skirmish. Unfortunately, Oñate's nephew was killed. In retaliation of having his nephew killed, Oñate sent a much larger army. After the siege and a battle, the Pueblo people, the Acoma people, were finally subdued. And what Oñate did is he took 25 young men, and he cut off their right foot as a sign to say that this is the policy, this is what's going to happen to you if you choose to defy the Spanish crown. He took 100 women and children. He divided them up and sent some to Mexico City, some to other Spanish communities in Mexico, and even sent some to Spain. There were two Hopi men that were in the Pueblo at the time. He cut off their right hand. He sent them back to Hopi land, which is west of New Mexico, and saying, this is a sign of what's going to happen to you if you choose not to abide by the Spanish crown. Eventually, Oñate was convicted of crimes against humanity by the Spanish court, but this is the policy that was started over the next 80 years of subjugation, religious persecution, forced servitude, enslavement, and subsequently the combined efforts of drought that occurred several times during that 80-year period, crop failures that existed, diseases that were going rampant because of the immunities that the Pueblo people had not encountered. And most importantly, as this whole society was changing, the Pueblo people had no further ability to trade with their neighbors, the Navajos, the Apaches, the other groups that were here, the Yaquis, and the Tarahumara of northern Mexico. So there was a gradual unbalancing of all these different societies. So now people are going hungry. And so their last resort is to raid one another. And so as they're raiding and causing conflicts, the Spanish are putting out one fire over here, another fire over here. And so there was a great deal of conflict going on. And so people were trying to find out the best way for them to survive. One important thing that occurs is in 1675. A man who comes from the Pueblo of Oquewenge, along with 38 other individuals, 38 other leaders and individuals in their communities met in what we now call Jemez, but the traditional name is called Walatoa. They met there to kind of discuss what they needed to do to address all these issues that they were being confronted with. Many of their community members were dying. There was a loss of their belief systems because they were blaming the Spanish for those ideas. There were some of the community members within each of their communities that perhaps maybe were partnering with the Spanish. They had converted to Christianity. And so they were trying to decide what they needed to do. An individual stood out as a leader amongst them. That man we now know as Popeye. Popeye, which was one of the leaders of those 38 individuals meeting up in Walatoa, were trying to decide what they wanted to do and how to address these issues that were their communities were being confronted with. They were discovered and they underwent a trial and found to be charged with heresy and insubordination. The sentence was a public flogging, so they were all whipped in public. To further cause the impact of the Spanish crown, another sentence was passed where 4 individuals were chosen amongst those 38 individuals. They were taken to each of their respective pueblos and publicly hung. Over the next several years, Popeye realized nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to cause these new invaders, these colonists, to see them as human beings. And so Popeye went to the Pueblo of Taos, where he hid in seclusion, trying to decide how they were going to address these particular issues that they were being confronted with. Over the next several years, he decided that they needed to act as a collective. Before the Spanish came, each of these communities were individual, distinct, separate, independent communities. There was not one group that says we're going to abide along with one another. However, they all interacted by trade and some level of interaction. Eventually, Popeye realized that the only way to address this issue, because it affected them all, was to decide to act decisively as a collective. And so what he did, beginning in the early part of 1680, was sent messengers out to tell how they were going to do this secretively as well as covertly. He had some ideas that the Spanish had anticipated certain regimen to how they were going to get supplies from Spain. We also know here how the weather is, that certain things occur in certain times of the year. And so what he did, he chose the month of August as a time when they would react to this incursion into their lands. So in the twilight hours of August the 10th of 1680, runners from each of the different pueblos with a cord of knots were sent to deliver this message. The runners were sent to many different corners of these communities. They had already spent some time in seclusion, passing along the information that what's going to occur once these runners come to their communities with this cord of knots. The knots indicated the number of days that they were going to react, and they were going to lash out against the Spanish colonizers. So as each day passed, they would untie the knot. The last day of the knot would have been August the 11th, which was the tentative plan for the day of the revolt against the Spanish colonizers. Unfortunately, in the Pueblo of Tusuque, two of the runners were encountered as they were running to the Pueblo of Galisteo, which is on the east side of the mountains that we face here in Albuquerque. Eventually, they were tortured, and they revealed what the knots meant. And so as a result, a day before the actual day of the revolt was occurred, actions were taken, and each of the different communities that the Pueblo people had Spanish individuals in their communities, they confronted them. The Spanish certainly have another perspective as it applies from the Pueblo narrative. The Pueblo people say they confronted them and demanded they leave. We have reports from the Spanish crown and written reports from those individuals. They said that they were attacked outright without any explanation. And so we can look at history from that regard, that history sometimes has parts that are missing. But we do know that on August the 10th of 1680, eventually some people did die, on both sides. We know that 32 of the Spanish priests that were in the communities were killed. We know that some Spanish settlers were killed. We also know that a number of Pueblo people were also killed as the Pueblo people confronted them and wanted them to leave. The remaining groups of Spaniards that were still here, being able to escape from the Pueblo people, sought their way up to Santa Fe. And they were able to hide out there because there was a larger garrison and a number of Spanish soldiers there. And for about a week, they were able to hold out against some small attacks from the Pueblo people. What the Pueblo people did is they cut off the river that gave water to the community members. And for a period of days, they were getting very desperate because they were not having any water. Eventually, they decided they needed to leave because they were in pretty dire straits. So as they're leaving, we know that they're coming down. They're coming to some of the pueblos along the Rio Grande. There's people that have been killed and still lying in the streets. The churches are burning. Some of the priests are still have been perhaps dismembered and or killed. And they come to the Pueblo of Isleta, which is south of Albuquerque right now. We have two stories from that as well. One is that the Spanish took some hostages, like perhaps deterrents, to prevent further attacks. Another story from the Pueblo people is that some of the people who had either intermarried or had become friends with the Spanish decided that they'd perhaps be seen as traitors, and so they left with the Spanish as a way to get away from perhaps being seen as traitors. And they only went as far as what we now call El Paso, Texas. And so we have another Pueblo there that are descendants of these Pueblos that left in 1680. The history of the Pueblo Revolt, again, when we compare it to the Declaration of Independence, there are significant similarities, but most importantly, there are significant differences in that it was really their reaching out, their effort to proclaim their right to exist. Not just a government policy, not just the right to be able to do the things they want to, but without the Pueblo people reacting to this way, they believed that there was no way they could exist. They were under so much stress, both physical, mental, and most importantly, spiritual stress, that they had to reach out, much like someone who is drowning, that someone fights for every existence that they have. That's the position that the Pueblo people were placed. The Spanish certainly were here with the certain expectations and the constructs of that God had given them this right. The Pueblo people, in their spiritual beliefs, felt that it was their right to be here, to have the corn, have the belief systems, have the ceremonies, have the prayers. All of those things were part of who they were as Pueblo people. New Mexico has a significant history of our communities living together now. Many of our Pueblo community members have incorporated the Catholic faith. We have many Spanish names. There are neighbors, there are in-laws, they're part of who we are. But only because of the struggles and strifes that we have all gone through as community members. The lands we have now, different from what most other Native American lands have, are sanctioned and recognized by the Spanish crown, by a sovereign. There are significant differences, and that's really what the whole mission statement is as it applies to the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. We bring these ideas, we bring this knowledge to help our guests understand, as Pueblo people, whatever ceremonies we practice, prayers, songs, designs, those are ours. They belong to us. And it's only because of our ancestors, those who preceded us, that we get to be here. I don't give my ancestors voice. I have voice only because of them. They have given me the right to tell our story, so that what things they endured is not lost. As the dust goes from the wind, we still have those very much part of our lives. The corn we grow, the vegetables, the fruits, the ceremonies, the feasts, everything is very much a part of who we are, even in the 21st century. The statue of Popeye is in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. It's one of the few Native American statues that represent Native people. But as I mentioned before, in comparing it with the Declaration of Independence, the Pueblo Revolt is much more than just a freedom or the desire for freedom. It's really the right to exist as human beings, the right to say that I'm here and therefore it's my right. And no one can define for me and tell me that I cannot be here. That's the essence of the Pueblo Revolt, and we share that here at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. The references on the screen are books that I recommend as far as reading. If you want to learn more about our Pueblo Revolt, you're welcome to go to our website at indianpueblo.org. We have a number of resources there. We welcome comments, questions, further edification if you'd like. We certainly would appreciate hearing back from you. I want to thank you for joining us for our presentation on the Pueblo Revolt. Again, August 10th, 1680 is the time that we recognize our right to be here, and we will continue to tell that story as long as we have breath as Pueblo people.